አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ ዌብሳይታችን www.adababai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ
Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. This is Adabai Media's Viewer Digest program. My name is Hiwat Tadessa and I'll be your host for today. Today we have invited a photojournalist, Jemal Countess, to come and talk to us about his recent visits, especially his multiple visits that he's done since TPLF started the war against Ethiopia on November of 2020. He'll be discussing with us the different issues and stories that he's witnessed in Tigray, Afar, and Amara regions, and also IDP camps across Ethiopia. I'd like to invite everyone to share this conversation with your loved ones and to stay with us. Thank you.
Adabai Media Yanina. Adabai Media Yanina. Adabai Media Yanina. Adabai Media Yahulachinina. Yenya Vetasab Adabai Media Malakatalian Nantas. Do your parents watch Adabai Media? Watch, follow, subscribe, and help Adabai. Adabai Media Logan Tanginet Jarwan Yasatar.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, my co-host will be Dr. Fisaha Yaakov. Dr. Fisaha, welcome.
Thank you so much, Yot. I'm excited to be here, and we have, as you say, a wonderful guest, a photojournalist, Jemal Countess, who has been documenting the plights of, our people in the northern part of Ethiopia, particularly in Mai Kadra, Lalibela, Afar, even Tigray, and different parts of IDP. So I'm actually excited to just kind of hear his experiences, stories, and I'm hoping our viewers also are going to be here for a major treat. And I just want to also warn people that the conversation might be highly emotionally charging. So I just want us to have to understand from horse's mouths. So I'm excited to be here, and I look forward to having this wonderful conversation with our brother Jemal.
Absolutely. I think it's always very, very important to be able to hear stories from people that have actually traveled across the board. They will have a more cohesive understanding of the issues that we are facing as Ethiopians as well. Dr. Fisaha, what should be our intention of listening to this conversation? What do you want our viewers to get from this conversation before we invite our guest onto the studio?
It's that's a very just the main thing is, as you said, to really understand the story of the people who have been suffering from the ground, and at the same time, Jemal has been there, so he's going to give us a real account using his pictures, using his video, and stories that usually you don't see in the mainstream media, right? So for the longest period of time, there is this competition of suffering and whatnot, but our people are suffering. So it's important to look at from that perspective and learn what can we do from moving forward. So I think, as I said, Jemal is going to really highlight major points that we may not be gaining those stories, those news. So as I said, it's at the end of the day, we need to understand the true account and work for justice. As Jemal has been saying, the reason he's doing this job is, as we can hear from him, at the end of the day, justice has to be served somehow. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will invite our guest onto the studio. Welcome, Jemal, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I guess to start this conversation, I know you've been a photojournalist for more than 30 years, and you've traveled across Ethiopia multiple times, especially since this conflict started. Could you tell us different areas and regions you've traveled to since this war started?
Well, I'll just go from west to east. Chagni, the IDP camps in and around Bahar Dar, the IDP camps in Gondar, north and south, Mai Kadra, Humera. I went to Mekelle when it was open, and after that, of course, it's been Sokoto, the A2 corridor, which is basically Wollo, and Afar.
So that's quite a large area you covered. I do remember, especially during when Mai Kadra happened, and we were trying to get stories of really what exactly happened, with mainstream media being what it is, as we know, and not being able to get as much of the detailed information as we needed to really understand what went down in Mai Kadra. You are one of the first people to travel there and get the stories of people and what they experienced. You shared photos with us and stories with us. Could you tell us why you traveled there, what you found, and why is it important for us to understand, as this was especially the first things we've seen when this war started?
Well, I was sitting at home, and without even seeing the tweet from Mike Pompeo about the Northern Command attacks, I had just moved to the States from Ethiopia the year before. So I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia. I mean, both my kids were born in Ethiopia, was married in Ethiopia, lived in different parts of Addis Ababa, and we moved there, or I moved there during the height of the end of the TPLF rule of the country, the last few years. And so I'd had experiences with that regime and with the leadership of the beginning of the Abiy administration. So I was looking at the way that news was coming out, and I just noticed things were just definitely off, because my wife would look at Ethiopian news, and I'm looking at American news because it's my field, so I have to monitor what happens from this side. And there were massive disparities. There wasn't even really an acknowledgement of the Northern Command attacks. And then I'm looking at the coverage from our the agency we distribute, AFP, and I'm seeing these pictures, and I'm just like, well, I'm not hearing about this on the American side. Yeah. And then things began to intensify in terms of misinformation, and I was like, well, I've got to go. this is my second home. I mean, this is my kids' home. So I need to go back and I need to really get these stories out and hear all sides, whenever and wherever possible. It's all about all sides of the story. So I made my inroads. I went through the channels of getting cleared through the government officially, and I went. I started to make these trips, and so I went to Mai Kadra with a team, 2 translators, an escort, and what have you. And when I arrived in Mai Kadra, I didn't really pay a lot of attention to the base at Dansha and some of the other bases that you pass by. We passed by the infamous tank that everybody has photographed. And I was just like, okay, I'm focusing on what happened. I really don't have, a war hawkish interest in, tanks and battle damage and all that kind of thing, because at the heart of all of this suffering is people. And a major massacre was said to have occurred here. So when I get to Mai Kadra, Reuters was actually there. And my team, we connected with the Kimberley officials from Mai Kadra. And they were saying that, Reuters had to change their translator because their translator was speaking a purely TPLF narrative, to the point where the people who he was translating for were being, were being gaslit. They were just like, what the hell are you talking about? We're not saying this. So we went in and we did 47 interviews, and I'm not including the Kimberley officials and, some of the church officials who basically were just telling their stories. But we interviewed 47 civilians, mostly women, because their husbands had been killed during the massacre. And what I began to find out, and then which people began to corroborate, was the fact that this was planned very far in advance. This wasn't just like a group of people who came into Mai Kadra to, just kill whoever they could and leave. This was about people being bused from 5 different towns in Tigray into the region, being marshaled there, being given their marching orders, and being unleashed in conjunction with the Northern Command attacks. So what began to take shape for me was the fact that this was all one plan. This was all a part of the coup attempt that was going to get everybody out of the way, and that the TPLF could return to power in 2 weeks, like they said. And the accounts in Mai Kadra and Humera just really kind of cemented that, at the end of the days, the time that we were there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jemal. As you speak, it's so emotional. I sometimes feel like while you speak, you can also be re-traumatized. I apologize for that. But given the extent of the massacre, the gruesome way of people left, right, center, killed and brutally murdered, have you ever thought why, from your perspective, why do you think they have done such a kind of horrific, basically, massacres and whatnot?
Well, when you listen to a woman who is carrying her daughter, or in many cases, son, her child on her back, and there's 1 or 2 people in particular in Mai Kadra who are sitting there like, the woman and her child are being held back while her husband's being hacked to death, stabbed and hacked to death. You're like, that's a lot of hatred. There's no strategic value. When you were being trained in the military, you learn about a kill strike. It takes 1 move to kill somebody, but for 5 or 6 boys to hack somebody with machetes and beat them with sticks and torture them shows a different level of hatred, anger, and emotion. And you conclude that there's no military value in this. This is all about extermination. And, when you began to hear about the fact that, okay, well, these killings occurred after these day laborers were made to harvest whatever was in the fields, and these harvests went to Mekelle with the generals who were the owners of those farms, and then whatever of the Samri and TPLF went that way. Basically, after Mai Kadra and Humera, people split off into two different directions. They either went back to Mekelle, they went into Tigray, or they went to Sudan. Most of the victims in Mai Kadra said that everybody went to Sudan. A good deal of people went to Sudan. And one of the victims that I interviewed said that he actually had went to Sudan with other IDPs and was chased out of his camp by Samri, who recognized him and he recognized them. Mainstream media, any of the other Western journalists who came in didn't spend enough time in Mai Kadra to even connect the dots. They went immediately to Sudan because, as I found out, in reference to that Reuters piece, there have been, this country was run by the TPLF for 27 years, and they put people in place in every corner of society to facilitate their staying in power.
Yeah.
So you also have people who, in effect, are still in power, still in place to help to control the narrative. So it comes down to the fixers. It comes down to people who are like, oh, I can guide you everywhere you need to go, but you're not really understanding that person could be intelligentsia. They could be a TPLF loyalist or a TPLF cadre. They could be anything, So people have been fed misinformation. They've been allowed to feed misinformation, or they've been a part of spreading the misinformation because they don't really know what they're dealing with on the ground, So people get to Sudan and they're interviewing these Samri. The Samri are a TPLF aligned youth group, or you can kind of say like TPLF youth to some degree. And they were the main instruments of the murder in Mai Kadra and Humera. So they came in, they were the main ones yielding the machetes, the long knives, whatever they could use to kill people. And anyone that they could not kill, regular TPLF came in behind and shot and killed. So the bulk of the Samri, after they finished in Mai Kadra, they went to Sudan. And then so what happens is, because the story is still, not the story, but the apparatus, the media apparatus is still following the TPLF model, and you still have a lot of people in place. Everybody goes to Sudan to interview these survivors. The TPLF convinces the Western world and Western media that, oh, well, it's hard to get access to these regions, so all we can do is go to Sudan. Mm-hmm. And so when you get to Sudan to interview survivors and IDPs, you're being introduced to the same people who killed people in Mai Kadra, and they're being passed off as victims. But if you look at some of the early photos, you have these people hiding their faces when they're in the food lines, able-bodied young men. I mean, aid workers reported that there are a lot of single, able-bodied young men coming across with no families, coming into these refugee camps in Sudan. And it struck them as odd. But these were the people who, killed over 1,500 people in Mai Kadra and Humera.
I think especially what I feel like the Mai Kadra situation set up is, if we really paid attention when it began, was how the war was going to be carried out in the last year and a half. That was a sample I felt like that we were given. Another thing also, as you mentioned, that these are the same people that were getting interviewed in Sudan. A few months later, the person that's calling himself the president of Tigray, Debretsion, said they have about 30,000 soldiers, able-bodied soldiers, ready in Sudan to invade Ethiopia again. And how did you see that piece of news being received in comparison to the testimonies people were given in the mainstream media, if that had changed it at all?
It wasn't. Over here in the U.S., and I'll just be quite blunt. I have people, I have journalists over here who are mad because, oh, my friend from NPR couldn't get into Ethiopia. My friend from BBC couldn't get into Ethiopia. And they immediately Well, first off, let's just be even clearer still. I mean, people are blatantly racist or closetly racist. They don't think Africans can tell their stories. So they're going to discount anything that comes from Africa. And then they're going to stop paying attention because, oh, well, my friends aren't there covering this, so I'm not going to pay attention because the government's corrupt. The government doesn't allow journalists in. And I'm like, well, I got in. AFP is there. AP is there. So-and-so's there. Oh, well, you're black and still you can't tell the story right. I mean, just keep it real. So that wasn't really received. I mean, a lot of us who knew or in the know, we knew it, but no. And because that interferes with that original narrative, people blew it off. I mean, I had a conversation with somebody who was interested in going a couple weeks ago, and they were talking like, well, my colleague reported that, once the attack started in Mai Kadra, then the Amhara turned on the Tigrayans and killed the Tigrayans. I'm like, who? If you look at the video, it's like they're all dead in the street and these women are mourning over their husbands. Yes, I mean, of course, there may have been some defensive attacks and defensive murders, but you have to keep it very real. The streets of Mai Kadra were red, I mean, not literally, but figuratively speaking, I mean, with dead bodies, with murder, gruesome murders. The farms had people murdered on them. There were dead bodies everywhere. And so it's kind of challenging to be in this position when you hear people who are misinformed and who continue to be misinformed because they want to be misinformed and they don't have respect for the voices of the storytellers who are actually there. So, no, it wasn't received. It's probably going to come up again, when we get further along and we start to rip the layers off of the lies that, Deborah Sion said. I mean, I've got 30,000 able-bodied soldiers in Sudan, Yeah.
It was quite interesting. And so that's basically set up how the war started. And if we look at what's going on right now, especially with humanitarian and aid organizations, what they're publishing and displace fictitiously what they call Western Tigray has been a big issue on the last 2 months, especially with multiple publications they're releasing with the title of Western Tigray. And as we know, there's no place called Western Tigray, not in the map of Ethiopia, not in the history of Ethiopia. And this is the area where Welkait, Agane, and Humera is currently in. And that's the area that TPLF really needs. One, to connect with Sudan if they were to become an independent country as Tigray. And two, because that's where the farmland is, right? So when we're looking at, especially when the war started, one of the wars that was fought was in that area where people from that area decided they don't want TPLF anymore, right? Because they've been in a war for 30 plus years. So I know you traveled to Welkait recently, and there was this short story you shared on Twitter, which we thought we should make into a video because it basically described what's been going on in Welkait for the last 30 years or since before even TPLF came to power. And we'll pick up that conversation after we watch this quick video.
Fetanu Gabriye, who is now a 66-year-old, spoke to journalists about his experience during his 11-year imprisonment at the hands of the TPLF during the TPLF occupation of Welkait on April 8, 2022 in Welkait, Ethiopia. First arrested in 1981, Fetanu Gabriye spent 11 years imprisoned in various prisons and torture camps in Welkait and Tigray after multiple arrests because he refused to succumb to TPLF's demand to renounce his identity as an ethnic Amhara or join the TPLF fighting force against the Derg. In 1987, Fetanu spent a year and several months at a torture camp known as Gahannan. During the TPLF occupation of the region, members of the Welkait Agani community were imprisoned, tortured, or murdered because of their identity. The torture prison Gahannan began operating 37 years ago in 1985 when the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, occupied Welkait as they fought against the Derg regime before gaining control of the country in 1991. The discovery of multiple mass graves and extermination camps have been taking place over the past year after the TPLF was pushed out of Welkait. Numerous Ethiopian and other scholars alike have stated that Welkait was part of Amhara's land for up to 10,000 years before it was annexed by the TPLF.
This is one of the stories of the person that you've shared, you've talked with. Could you tell us when you went to Welkait and what you found there?
We went to Welkait. It was at the end of March. Let me just make sure, because it's important to be accurate. Yeah, at the beginning of April, the first week of April. I had been hearing about Welkait, and I make a joke about this. My wife's a history teacher, and she used to teach history and civics in Addis, and she's been talking about Welkait since we met, saying how critical an issue Welkait was. Actually, when I conducted my interviews in Humera after Mai Kadra, it came up, and the history people they talk about the way things changed after the TPLF arrived. They talk about how Humera was this like booming business center with Jews, Arabs, people from other parts of Africa who were all there because it was a trading center and a business center. And once the TPLF came, it was like the area went dark, spiritually, psychologically, for a lot of people. So I had been hearing about Welkait, but then once the University of Gondor released their information and made their findings, I told my partner Sheba that I was traveling with at the time, like, I gotta go. We gotta go. We definitely have to go. And so it was a long journey, several hours on the road, a night in Adrament, and then a night in a town just outside of Adisalam. But I don't think I was prepared for it. I kind of knew it would be bad, but I don't think I was prepared for, what we saw.
Thank you for that, Jemal. That's very gruesome and powerful, particularly with respect to Welkait. As you said, technically genocide and crimes against humanity have been unfolding before our eyes. Yet it seems that the world chose to ignore or turn space away. With respect to that, being in that area, how challenging was it just to uncover such kind of magnitude of bodies and people who have been massacred being unearthed at that time? How difficult was that?
Well, the University of Gondor's work has been ongoing, and what we did was we got to Adisalam after we explored some of the torture prisons at an area, a network of prisons called Badu Sidist. And from there, we went to Adisalam. And what you find is, according to witnesses and survivors, a town that parts of it have been built on mass graves. And in addition to that, you have graves of opportunity. You have, I talk about the actual grave digger, one of the survivors who dug graves for the TPLF because he was commanded to. And he knows where these graves are. He remembers where these graves are. And it's, he will show you there's graves here, there's graves here, there's graves here. I dug a hole here. And he can just go through that town doing that area. And this picture that you have up, the gravedigger is actually not in this photo because he's on the other side of the hill helping to excavate a grave. So, and what he's saying is that they dug these holes in such a way that people were just dumped in. So you may have a hole that may have as many as 9 to 10 people in it, a deep vertical hole. In other places, they excavated the mass areas and would dump 25, 35, 40 people in that one hole and just cover them up and then start another one next to that. So on my last day in Adisalam, I struck out and I went to a mass grave behind the hill. And just like that, on one plateau is 24, on another plateau is 36, you know, and potentially I was told, I haven't verified this, but I was told that this area may have up to 59,000 people in this one part of Welkait. So, you know, growing up on the works of, you know, my colleagues who had been to Rwanda, who, you know, even been to Cambodia and Laos and what have you. I mean, it was just, it's kind of mind blowing, because when other societies, other people go about to do recoveries like this, they have massive amounts of resources. And I just, you know, the University of Gondar really needs the help. They need the resources, you know, they need the forensic experts, like in massive numbers, to kind of help with like these excavations, you know, to bring closure to these people who've been missing their relatives for years. I mean, there's members of the Welkait community around the world who probably all have people missing, you know, and would probably like some closure in any way they could get it.
This is very, very painful, Jemal. Thank you so much. With respect to the ignorance, do you think is TPLF doing a great job in just kind of propagating their narrative, or is it just the willful ignorance of the mainstream media as well as the international, the NGOs? What do you think went wrong there in that case that we don't hear this in the mainstream media, this magnitude of massacres in this day and age?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that people, and I'm not trying to trivialize the issue, I think that people want their favorite team to stay in good light and to regain power. They basically despise the current government of Ethiopia. They have believed all of the propaganda about ethnic Amharas, and they come with that bias. So when you hear about something that affects ethnic Amharas, it doesn't matter as much, you know. Our focus is the North and the people of Tigray. They're suffering, they're starving, they're this and they're that. And so this severely, it destroys the credibility of the TPLF in any way, shape, or form. And people can't take that. They don't want to even think about that at all, because that means that these guys are wrong, and that means I'm wrong, you know. So it's intentional. It really is intentional. It is completely intentional. I mean, people are trying to say, oh, well, these are Tigrayan victims. I'm like, well, you know, if you look at this video and you look at some of the people who've been digging, you know, people are family members digging for relatives, people identifying family members off of articles of clothing, you know. Several of the witnesses who remember who was buried where, remember when, you know, a group of maybe 20 or 30 people are marched out of Gehenna, marched down the road to a hill, and, you know, they were never seen again. So it's like, if I see my neighbor as part of that group march down the hill to this burial site that's behind a mountain in such and such a place, then I'm going to know where when somebody asks me 30 years, 25 years later. So the gaslighting, trying to convince people who saw the death that they didn't see the death of their neighbors. These are not the people that you saw. It's insulting, morally beyond compare, you know.
And I just want to also pick up in this, because I saw one of you tweeted, and you just kind of retweeted again, the fact that you point that out. On top of losing their relatives, their families, their friends, people are not even grieving with dignity. How can you speak to that, please?
Well, first off, a lot of the digital Woyen, as they're called, they're doing these tweets from the comfort of some, you know, European or Western home, not even coffee shop, they're probably just their homes, you know, people who have way more than the people that they're tweeting about. They live way more comfortable lives. And it's just, you know, tweeting as a part of warfare, psychological warfare. They're being gaslit. I think what's most troubling for me is, you know, the same people who walk the halls of our federal institutions here in DC are buying into this. There are people in government positions in the US and Canada and Europe who are retweeting and endorsing this stuff, some of which have maybe never been to Ethiopia, but they're repeating TPLF propaganda. So then it's like they're telling the person in Welkait whose son disappeared 30 years ago, not only is that not your son that you just dug out of a grave, that's a Tigrayan. That's a member of the TPLF. They're killed by Amhara, It's absurd. And it's really trying to respect any institutions right now. It's really trying, because the levels of corruption and immorality are through the roof, completely through the roof.
Fact, yeah, thank you. That's very deep, and I know we can talk about Welkait all day, all night, but we gotta move to Lalibela, where I know you've been to the small village near Lalibela, Aina Jesus. Can you tell us what residents told you, what life looked like, under the occupation of TPLF at the time? What was something that stood out for you, and then the sufferings of these people?
Well, I had friends in Lalibela who had to struggle to get food, and it was a situation where food was scarce because supply lines were cut, and then eventually there were no supplies. And so for either group, the TPLF who were occupying or the residents of Lalibela, people had stashed food, but they didn't cook during normal hours. They would cook at night, because if they saw smoke, the TPLF saw smoke coming from your house, they would go and raid your house asking for food. I remember specifically one of my friends, he had to leave because, of course, they were attacking young men in Lalibela. So all the young men and middle-aged men left, but his wife was behind with their baby. And the baby was traumatized because they found food at a house nearby. So whenever they found food, they would fire shots into the air, So, and that would be a signal for people to come to the house where they found food and eat. And so I recall him telling me about this situation where his daughter was rattled by that for a long time. But all in all, outside of the burning down of the police station and some of the government offices in Lalibela was untouched. And that was majorly a PR decision, because if you had done damage to Lalibela, then they would never have lived that down. What they did do was do damage outside of Lalibela in other places. So Aina Jesus was a town where, when it was first occupied, over the course of 3 days, 32 women were raped, including a 12-year-old girl. And, I'll call it the TPLF machine that was in operation was one where cadre would come into the town, they would take food, they would loot, and then in the course of those two operations, people would be raped. The lorries would come in, they'd load up the trucks, and they would go back to Mekelle. So in all of these towns where this happened, especially on the A2 and in other parts of Amhara and Afar as well, people had their resources taken. The hospitals were emptied, the pharmacies were emptied, food stores were emptied, and women were victimized. And then in some of the other cities, the violence was more extreme than other places, as in Desi and Kambolcha. But yeah, there was a pattern of behavior. And so these lorries would go back to Tigray full of supplies. But yeah, Aina Jesus is special, and it's just typical of what happened in other towns like Nufus Melcha, if I'm saying that right, and some other places as well.
Thank you. That's very gruesome. That's very powerful. At the same time, very painful to even listen to. What's transpired. And I would also like you to comment on this tweet, please. Could you please elaborate this? You tweeted like in December 26, 2021, and still the narration seems to be stuck in somewhere with the ideology of TPLF. Yet you have been witnessing this. Could you please speak to these tweets before I let you take over?
Well, this was the 12-year-old girl. This was near her home, because I wasn't going to show her face I wasn't going to show her place of residence. I was not going to do anything, even though people want you to tell their stories. There's still an amount of responsibility that you have to the victims, especially of such heinous and violent crimes. So, this is a typical story. These soldiers, they got drunk on that Friday night. They came to her door. She was sleeping with family members, and they dragged her out and raped her. Now, I think it's atrocious that Western media and folks have just decided to ignore these stories for the sake of making the TPLF right all the time. It's like stories like this get ignored because you can't have your favorite team be cast in a bad light. And so these stories get buried. And it can have an impact on you. It can make you feel very, very deeply frustrated, And I think that people should know that when you work for a wire service like this, we have over, 2,400 clients. So every major publication in the world and every major newspaper and TV station are amongst the client list in all countries across the globe, So these kind of stories go out into the feed, and editors make the decision to pick these stories up and how they use the photos. So you see a story like this come across, and somebody makes a decision to ignore it because it doesn't fit a larger narrative, or it makes, it makes it harder to continue with a false narrative.
Absolutely. And I think with that as well, we've seen even some of your pictures being used contrary to where you took the picture and what stories you heard while you were taking those photographs as well. And that's to pick, their favorites as well. And part of that, I think, for us, especially that want to hear what's going on in Tigray, that want to understand how people are living in Tigray, it's really difficult for us to pick up a newsletter or even just social media information, trying to understand what's going on, because it feels like everything that comes out of Tigray is TPLF propaganda. And I know you've traveled into Tigray. Can you tell us when you traveled and how you were able to tell stories, and really how difficult is it that for people to travel into Tigray, because we are consistently being told there's a blockage, no one could come in and come out, so stories are not going to be able to be told. But then we see stories published in the New York Times and the Washington Post and such. How does that look like? Can you help us understand what is going on there?
Well, Tigray was open when the ENDF was in charge of or occupying Tigray up until July of last year. So while it was open, a lot of the focus of my coverage is displaced people. It's like everyday citizens, and how is this war affecting everyday citizens? So I reached out through the Ministry of Broadcast, I reached out to the interim government in Tigray, and I asked for government officials, because I wanted people to show me the truth with facts and figures, right? Yeah. So I went to 2 different IDP camps. Well, that's all I was allowed to see, really. 2 different IDP camps, 3 different feeding stations. And I also was able to wander around Mekelle a little bit by myself. And so access to the IDP camps was through a government official escorting you in and letting you just kind of talk to people and see what's going on. And not really getting a lot of conversation from people, more so from women, elderly people. The camps had a lot of women and children, and then some middle-aged men and what have you. But there were some camps that I was warned away from going to because they say you wouldn't be received well. They're very aggressive. So I was like, okay, fine. But the camps that I did go to, ironically, the one camp I went to had IDPs from Humera and Welkait, which I thought was interesting because, the stories I had heard on the previous trip were that after the killings, most people either went to Sudan or went to Mekelle, and that there were very few, if any, Tigrayans in Welkait or in Mai Kadra and Humera after, March, April of last year. So it just kind of stuck with me. I thought that was interesting, to say the least. But yeah, I felt like I was being limited, being stymied when I was in Tigray because I didn't choose one of the fixers from the hotel. I mean, these fixers at the Northern Star Hotel were all a part of a network that were just being passed around by Western news organizations that were coming in, who were showing them basically what they wanted them to see. And after it became apparent that I wasn't interested in that, I was just interested in telling human stories and telling exactly what's happening. It's like a wall went up. And for a couple of days, I didn't get anything done. I did some aid work, some voluntary aid work on my own, but I was cut off from stories. And then eventually it got to a point where one of the workers at the hotel just kind of whispered to me, maybe you should go. So because I had been expressing frustration about, how come nobody wants to take me to Adigrat? How come nobody wants to take me to such and such? Everybody's trying to get me to go to, there's this town that supposedly had been destroyed by white phosphorus, but it was proven not to be destroyed by white phosphorus. But I didn't want to go that road. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to talk to everyday people about what they were feeling and suffering. When I went to the schools that were supposedly closed, and I found an elementary school full to capacity with kids who were actually being kids. That was interesting because, you're there on the ground and Western media outlets are being represented. But then again, Western media outlets are saying, oh, well, the schools are closed and there's limited this and there's limited that. And I'm just like, I'm here. This school is open. That school is open. This school is an IDP camp. Yes. But it's just like, they have an aid warehouse next door, a lot of inconsistencies. And I just kind of felt like if you didn't want to toe the line and tell a certain narrative, you weren't welcome.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think part of that also, as we've seen this year during Tumgat, I believe, when we were celebrating and back in January, people in Tigray were not allowed to celebrate because of, how horrible the Ethiopian government is and all such. But a few weeks later, they were out celebrating the founding of TPLF. So that narration continues to stifle the stories that are coming out of Tigray the way we need to hear them to really understand what's going on in Tigray. To add to that, I know you've also traveled across Afar and Amhara in IDP camps. Could you tell us just in general what you've witnessed, what stood out for you in your travels?
Immeasurable suffering. Yes, food shortages of water, no sanitation, limited sanitation, people basically defecating not 5 feet from where they sleep and 3 more feet from where they eat. It's unreal. It's unreal. And it's one of the things that after I did a lot of work in a camp in Bahardar called Zanzalima, where a lot of the people from Wag Hemra and Sakota were living. And I actually recognized some people when I returned to Sakota this last trip to the IDP camps, but there were still, the impact was like, Zanzalima and Emabet and some of these other camps just yielded things that it's like, why am I seeing this? I mean, I see aid trucks on the road. I see, these aid companies or these aid NGOs talking about how much money they're sending into Ethiopia to deal with quote unquote Northern Tigray. And we're fussing about Northern Tigray. We're fussing about Tigray. We're fussing about, people starving in Tigray. And, I'm walking past emaciated, challenged people in Afar and Amhara, in particular in Amhara, that in some cases are dealing with being displaced twice, multiple times, sometimes 3 times, displaced by the famine in the early years, displaced by the Sheni in recent months, and to end up in an IDP camp somewhere in Amhara. Resources limited, done, So
Absolutely. There was one photo you shared that stood out with me. Let me see if I can find it, of young men. I know there's a few of them. I'm just showing 2 of them. Is there a story behind these that you could share with us?
these 2 men are Tigrayan. These are Tigrayan IDPs who had left the camp in Kobo. Kobo is home to a large IDP camp of people from Tigray who wanted to escape the TPLF. These men left the camp in Kobo and are now in a camp in Hike, or just outside of Hike. And they agreed to talk and conduct an interview, but they didn't want their faces shown because they're worried about the repercussions from the TPLF towards their family back in Tigray, and potentially from people maybe even in the same camp. This is one of the camps that Ann Fitzgerald had visited in the course of her research. And she interviewed, multiple Tigrayans who discussed how aid was being withheld from civilians and going straight to the TPLF, armed services, new recruits, and party members, basically friends of the TPLF. So it was interesting. I thought it was kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
That you had somebody who she was able to talk to more people because she didn't have a camera. I mean, you have to realize that a camera really freaks everybody out. Like any visual evidence of anything that can get back to the TPLF really scares people. And it's to the point where even the elderly who were in the camp would turn their back if the camera was even near them, So.
Yeah, I mean, I think people living under TPLF, we really understand it's a very vengeful regime that doesn't even, turn away from its own friends and family. So it's very understandable how people would be unwilling to be photographed and videotaped, because that lasts forever. And TPLF seems to have a very long memory in not forgiving folks. Dr. Fasad, do you have anything to add?
Thank you so much, Jemal. Speaking of the frontline voice, recently Professor Fitzgerald completed a really great reflective piece that technically what you say that literally reflecting on the Tigrayans IDPs, that their concerns, their expression. In that case, I know you have visited the same IDP that she has visited. So what is your take on her results, her findings? And in that case, with respect to what do the IDPs from Tigrayan community told you?
Well, I mean, her work was incredible. It was very thorough, well put together, and I just think that it's a very damaging narrative. It's basically refuting everything that all the upper echelon officials and cheerleaders for the TPLF return to power. It's refuting everything they're saying. And there's a reason, and that's probably the main reason why it's kind of been buried or has not received the respect in the mainstream media that it should. These kind of documents would normally make for change. They call for emergency sessions of, congressional committees or what have you to discuss exactly what's going on. But it was attacked immediately by friends of the TPLF. Yeah. So it was great. It was great.
Yeah, absolutely. We can continue back to the Afar IDPs, and I just want to also come back to that with respect to the Anne's reflective piece. That, as you said, it kind of demystify and debunk their already narrative as it goes, completely counter to what they have been feeding the international mainstream news outlet. And I've seen also the attack left, right, center against this professor who has been, literally doing her research. She's a well-seasoned researcher, but as you said, the finding didn't come. It's not taken kindly. So, coming back to the Afar IDPs, what are some of the, I know Afar has been suffering a lot, immensely, but at the same time, they are so resilient, particularly with respect to the women, the way they're building their houses, the way they, So, can you speak to that? What are some of the lessons we also learn in that case, and what is the story you're hearing from them as well?
I went to Chifra, the IDP camp outside of Chifra, twice. And what you come across is, yes, you have resilient people, but they're still human beings. There's only but so much people can take. People were coming from cities where they were being shelled from the mountains, and they were in the towns below. So a lot of people had to flee with whatever they had on. And their husbands, their partners, were on the front lines. So what you have is a lot of IDP camps with women, children, and elderly. This picture you're showing are of widows who lost their husbands, who were civilians actually, who were killed when the TPLF invaded some of these warriors in Afar. You still, regardless of how resilient and how warrior like the Afari are, like I said, they're still human beings. They still have needs. They still need aid, water, food, sanitation, right? They still need proper living facilities. And I've told other people that if you really want to study the bold-faced nature and the brutality of the TPLF, the Afar didn't attack them. They attacked the Afar. And they have been relentless in what they've been doing in Afar. And the whole TPLF scenario in Afar, going back to when the party first came to power, is the perfect story to try to explain who the TPLF are. As it was explained to me, the Afari culture and society is, built around the existence and the network of elders. And, they controlled their resources. They controlled so many different things. When the TPLF came to power, they got the elders together and they killed them. And then the TPLF took over, mineral, salt, and tourism in Afar. So much so to the point where tourists were being told the only way to get to these tourist attractions in Afar was through Mekelle. People didn't even know there was an airport in Samara. They didn't even know Samara existed. So those kind of things sit with me as I look at the whole Afar situation. But Afar is particularly brutal because of the temperatures, because of the extremes, And so couple the fight for survival under normal conditions as an IDP, but now with these temperatures like floating around 90 degrees Fahrenheit and up, for a long period of time, extended period of time. This is like your low for the day, not even your high, So no, Afar is particularly brutal in that regard.
Absolutely. There were some stories that we covered here on Adawa as well when it comes to Afar on how unique the war was. Not to say that it wasn't different in every region they were in, but especially because there's no water, especially because most Afaris are still travel across to take care of their animals. So the first thing they did was any religious sites, any schools, as they've done everywhere else. But also another part was they closed down the roads so people don't migrate down to Samari. And then to go, the next area they could go to is Eritrea. And to cross Eritrea, they have to cross through one of the hottest places on earth. So there is a sense of that we don't really know quite how many people have been killed or how many people have really been affected in Afar, because some of the regions that TPLF still controls, we don't know what went down in those areas. As well as, yes, we could talk about how brave the Afaris are, but TPLF didn't come with handguns. They came in with heavy artilleries where people in Afar can't really defend themselves against. So it's been really heart-wrenching to watch what's going on. Even looking at, I think, some of the IDP sites, the pictures, at least for me, what made it unique was how dry everything else looked. There is no shade. People could hide. Again, it's the natural things, right? There's no water. And one of the person that was living in Afar told us that people are dying out of not food these days because there's no water to drink. Babies were dying right after they were being birthed because of the heat, and the elements are just open and about, and a newborn is not being able to survive that. And it's been really heart-wrenching to watch. We watched this woman's story that lost 5 of her children. She didn't know where they were when she was running away from the fighting that was going on. And it's been really difficult to watch and hear stories coming out of Ethiopia in general. But I think Afar is so close to date as well. It's been really hard to digest the level of horror that was committed. There was also a story that we were told about. The first people they were purposely killing in Afar were also the elderlies and Tigrayans that lived in Afar because they wouldn't align with TPLF. So there were incidents of that as well that people that were living in Afar witnessed. So it's been really difficult to see that. And I was wondering if you've seen, not just in Afar, but in other regions as well, that stories that are missing from the mainstream, not just the Western mainstream media, but as well as our own medias and things that we're not seeing to really grasp and understand the depth of this conflict and the depth of the cruelty TPLF is committing on the people of Ethiopia.
I would have to say that, the situation with Welega is definitely up there. There are people coming out of Welega who are walking over 20 days to get into Wollo, to get to safe havens, to get away from the Sheni. I will say that, these camps all yield, extremely brutal stories. Sokoto is bad. I didn't make it. I missed an objective in Sokoto because it was too close to the front lines. And they said that's where the starvation and brutality was the worst. Malnourishment, lack of resources, et cetera, so forth, and the temperatures. I can't even right now. And I look at everything, I can't pinpoint something that's worse than the other place. But the bigger crime is that the international media is ignoring all of this and repeating the TPLF talking points. I mean, I keep harping on that being here because I want you to try to picture what it is to walk into some of these pristine organizations, whether it be Capitol Hill or the White House, and rub shoulders with journalists and rub shoulders with people who have so much power to tell stories, and they just don't do it. And they're relying on the propaganda machine of an organization that has prided itself on, we're getting closer to our goal of exterminating ethnic Amharas and, regaining control of Ethiopia. We control everything. You look at a group like this with tentacles and operatives in every major international organization in the world, it seems, that has an Ethiopian office or what have you. And, you're mystified, you're horrified, it's beyond reason. I mean, we're being kept from a lot of stories. I really wish that, more journalists would go in with a desire to give everybody their voices, and not just following the lead of Tedros or other people who are like, the story's in Tigray, the story's in Tigray, the story's in Tigray. Well, if the story's in Tigray, some of those stories are leaving Tigray for a reason. So the stories are now out of Tigray. So you should maybe talk to these people as well,
Excellent, thank you. With respect to mainstream media, NGOs, and this, as you said, as you're speaking, like there has been a continuous psychological warfare again, particularly with respect to the mainstream media, from the U.S. Embassy, from the constant misrepresentation and misinformation of the reality. Can you speak to that, and what is the impact of all this psychological war waged against Ethiopia from left, right, center? It's not just it's just one direction. It's just it's multipolar from foreign policy, from organizations, highly structured and organized. What is your take on that?
Well, my opinions, my thoughts are my own. They don't represent anybody that I work for or what have you. But I believe there's several things that work. And, I'll speak, things that hit me personally. I believe that there's a large global anti-Orthodox sentiment against Ethiopia. Completely. I believe that there is a large anti-Ethiopian government /Abiy sentiment in the world. And I'll just, speak it like I would here in the States. A lot of white people are mad that this little black boy didn't yield to what they wanted. That's just the way we would say it, Now, do I agree with everything that Abiy has said and done? Maybe not. You know what I mean? Do I agree with a lot of policies that the government has enacted? Maybe not. Who agrees with any government that they live with? The point is, it's not up for a group of old white men and women here to decide what happens in Ethiopia, just because you may not like Abiy Ahmed. You understand? So there's a concerted effort to change regimes. There's, the whole anti-Christian or anti-Orthodox Christian thing. There is the sentiment of we must control these black people in East Africa. They say they were never colonized. Well, we'll show them. Then there's the allegiance to the TPLF. There's a lot of things that work here that, they're not conspiracy theories. It's just straight up fact. And when you challenge some of these Western journalists and Western people on it, they go for, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty said this and that, so we're going to believe them. We're not going to believe you, even though you've seen different with your own eyes. So it's a concerted effort by several parties to change things.
That's exactly, when you talk about that, this concerted effort, particularly the seemingly NGOs that's supposed to be right-based organization, that's supposed to be championing the voice of the victims, but you see at the end of the game, at the end of the day, you point out that regime change plan, that discourse of control, right? So with respect to this, do you think the role of NGOs and these international organizations and whatnot, where do you see them prolonging the conflict, or kind of, as you said, it's not conspiracy, but with respect to that, how are they impacting the conflict in Ethiopia right now?
Well, when you lie about something and you slant the truth or you omit the truth, you intensify the problem. You intensify the issue. You have to understand the role of NGOs. I'm not going to say that I'm perfect in understanding it. Once again, it's my feelings and my experiences. The whole reason that, I volunteer for several smaller NGOs is that I don't like the way big NGOs operate. It's a business. You have a country director who comes into a country like Ethiopia, but he's being paid, or she's being paid, an American salary. So they are making anywhere between, $80,000 and $125,000 a year. They're kids. They don't go to regular public school. They go to the French school or the American school, the private schools in Ethiopia. So tuition, $25,000 per year times 2 kids, then you've got to pay for the house. You've got to pay for the car. You've got to pay for the expenses. If you're an NGO that gets $1 million towards your project, the country director and his family alone have just eaten up $250,000 of your budget, right? Then you've got your office supplies, you got your office this and that. So when it comes down to getting food to your target group or getting aid to that target group, they're getting 35%, 30% of that money that's bought in for that project. And people don't want to give that up. They want to live nice, cushy lives and have their kids go to the best school in that country.
No.
But who ends up suffering? The very subject, the very reason you have this NGO is why people are suffering. I mean, it's the people who are suffering the most. They're not getting what they could. Could you imagine what you could do with $1 million with, just the people of Sokoto alone?
Absolutely. I hear you. And the way that there's also this narrative, probably in some other point, we'll talk about the impacts and the role of technically these NGOs and the reproduction of poverty. In a way, as you say, the amount of money technically does not reach the quote unquote the poor people, but the name is the poor people and this and that. Speaking of that, can you speak to the weaponization of aid? Now you see even the TPLF is getting a lot of the aid and whatnot, but then they're weaponizing that against. And at the same time, coming back to even the IDPs, when they left from the Tigray themselves, they were indicating the shortage of food and then how aid is being manipulated. What do you think of that?
Well, based upon the people I've spoken to, aid has been getting to Tigray all along, first off. Secondly, it's like, once again, if you control the voice, you control the access to the narrative, you control everything. These stories aren't getting out. I can't open the Washington Post tomorrow and see that, 50 Tigrayan IDPs interviewed by Ann Fitzgerald said they're not getting aid because it's all going to the soldiers. I can look at, Ethiopian media and see that, but I can't look at any mainstream Western media and see that. It's all about manipulation of the information. And that again makes it frustrating because the people I talked to in that camp and hike, were terrified, but also deeply frustrated, and the guy in the red shirt, we had a frank conversation, right? And he was like, you know what? Yeah, I mean, there needs to be new blood in TPLF. He was a TPLFite. He was about a new TPLF, getting rid of the old blood, and that was his opinion. He was like, yeah, I believe in a TPLF. We just need new blood. Right. But these people are really hurting. Right. They're hurting.
Absolutely.
They're hurting. And that's the issue. And the thing is, the aid organizations, with the weaponization of aid and the propaganda and, the BS that's being spewed, and that they're told to be spewed, to be being spewed. Sometimes you just wake up in the morning, you don't even want to turn anything on, but you have to, because, the justice mission is an everlasting one, so, and you got to think about the IDPs that you covered, the people who still don't have running water, the people who, aren't lactating, aren't producing milk because they're stressed, so.
Yeah, I will, it's like his Jemal is really pointing something very powerful, and I just want to say thank you for that. But at the same time, it's riveting. It's like kind of heart wrenching, and as we speak, this is not something that is past. It's ongoing. It's happening right now, right? So, what are some of the obstacles you've observed in so that aid is not reaching properly to concerned parties, for instance?
When I was working in Zanzalima, I saw outside organizations from the US and Canada and other people who were just sending money, sending resources, right? And, the IDPs would come to me and tell me, well, all of that aid that came in last week is locked up in this warehouse and we can't access it, right? Then you come back for a follow-up visit and they were like, remember that aid we told you about that was in the warehouse? We finally got into the warehouse and it's gone. Somebody sold it. Or, they're basically taking it and redistributing it, or they're selling it, right? stuff that was donated, they're selling it to make money, So even on those levels, you're dealing with, spots of corruption. By who? We don't know. Opportunistic people. What I suggested in an article I wrote was anybody who is sincere about fixing this issue must know that it's about sacrifice. If you've got 10 friends and you all raise $100,000, you all take turns coming to Ethiopia to distribute that aid, to oversee it. So you make sure that every time you distribute aid, 2,000 people walk away with aid for a month. You understand, or clothes, or whatever the aid package is. And you oversee the distribution of aid. When you have too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, the food gets burnt, right? Yeah. People are not getting stuff. And it just takes a level of sacrifice where you get up, go, do the work. Somebody replaces you in 2 to 3 weeks, and you do that. If this is what your vacation time is used for, it's far more valuable than, sitting on a beach somewhere doing nothing,
Absolutely. I think especially with what's going on as you're telling us, I've noticed, at least when the organizations, Amar organizations and Afar organizations that collect money and actually go and give these donations, even the churches here or in Ethiopia that is raising money, giving this aid personally to the people, it seems like it gets there, because I've heard that, some places people are able to get 50 kilos of something and 20 kilos of something that really does last at least a week or two. And that's, that's sustainable. That makes it a bit more sustainable until the next aid comes in. So I really appreciate your points in not just throwing money at the problem, but making sure that we get involved personally, and making sure that even if we can't go, the money we're sending it to is someone we trust could use that money to buy the things that we need them to buy. Because my other worry is also, we're raising all this money, and maybe this money is going towards the war effort as opposed to feeding people the way we want it to. Another thing also I want you to comment on along with this is, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, who could tell our stories, right, to be able to be heard. And when we're talking about to be able to be heard, what we call the international community, the Western world, basically, for me to say this is what's going on in Ethiopia, I'm automatically going to be labeled bias, right? Because I can't possibly tell my own stories, the stories of my own people, without bias, just seeking justice and really truth by default, right? So we need people that are outsiders, foreigners, to come in and tell our stories, to be able to be heard, to get that sympathetic ear that we need in that day-to-day person of someone that lives in America or Canada or in Europe, right? And if we change that political view, if we could change that one person, then it would be easier for us to talk to our senators, our representatives and such. So how do we make sure that people like you and others could make it to Ethiopia and tell these stories with dignity the way we need it, to make sure that this conflict, one, gets the right stories being told, the correct stories are being told, and two, we stop it from going on and on and on for the next 5 years and 10 years and be able to end it as soon as possible?
I theorized about this. I've thought about it. And it actually takes, I'm about to get in trouble. It actually takes journalists who care, first off, not journalists who fetishize Africa or East Africa or, Ethiopia, but people who care. And then people who know the history. One of the most impactful encounters I had during my travels was all of that exchanging at the Northern Star Hotel in Mekelle. And I was with journalists who didn't really know about Mai Kadra. I was with journalists who were mad that, Abiy gave Welkait back to the Amhara. And I just sat there and I was like, I need a drink, seriously.
Yeah.
You're dealing with people who work for big organizations who do more chest beating and who are more arrogant about who they work for as opposed to how they do their job. I think that there's a certain amount of humility that's required and respect. There are people who come into Africa who want a free trip, who want to deal with this exotic Africa, who just don't respect Africa. anywhere in Africa, right? So I would like to honestly ask for, for a change in the field of journalism. And then secondly, you might have encounters where people assume that Ethiopian-born journalists might be biased, but so how am I qualified to tell stories in America? You know what I mean? It's just like you have to realize that journalism needs to get back to being what journalism is: objective truth telling and storytelling. And you have to actually train and have confidence in the people who grew up in Ethiopia, in Africa, to tell those stories, because when you go around and you deny access to somebody who is Ethiopian, but you give it to the Ferengi, you send a message. We need to be honest about raising the next generations of Ethiopian powerhouses. I mean, I taught photography. I'm laughing at the fact that when the TPLF was still in power, I got arrested in Ntoto with 17 of my students doing a photo walk, just photographing Ntoto, flowers, trees, people who lived in Ntoto. We were detained for 3.5 hours. And some of those photographers are still working, but how many of them have access to actually represent their own country right now, aside from 2, right? Actually 1 who was in that group. So I think we need to have confidence in our people who are homegrown. We have to nurture them, train them objectively, give them voice. And at the same time, maybe try to ask or work with the international community to be like, if your correspondent comes here, your correspondent really needs to know this country. Your correspondent needs to know this country. They need to know the ins and outs, right? And if they did, they wouldn't have been making the mistakes that they did. But at this stage, I'm convinced that those weren't mistakes. I'm convinced that a lot of that was intentional, and it was about regime change.
Absolutely. Dr. Fasaha, Jemal, thank you so much. We've had such a productive conversation. We've covered so many topics. Before we close this program, could you both give me your last words on this topic and what you wish for Ethiopia in the coming year and years and for the generations to come?
Okay. Doctor?
Okay, thank you. You pose. Jamal. First of all, I really want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of those victims, voiceless victims, whose voices, whose bodies and blood and flesh is not counting. But you're actually doing justice for them for what is true to be journalism, and at the same time, I really appreciate and commend the ethical values. As you said a while ago, journalism needs to be, back to where it should belong. Yes, I argue with that, but unfortunately, it's being weaponized and being, information is being reused and recycled to further inflict pain. But I commend you for that, and and in the meantime, and I need you to just also look after yourself, and I wouldn't be. I just want you to just speak to also before I let you go about the psychological impact on yourself as a person. How do you tackle this? Because I know we're almost done, but I just want to how do you kind of recharge after this inducing trauma? Because what you're going through is like what you're seeing is absolutely horrific, traumatizing, and how do you cope with that? And what are some of them the recommendation you make in moving forward? What needs to be done? As you before, she said before she just we lost her. What do you think?
I think we need to be aggressive about training our young people and our any people who want to really be storytellers and truth tellers. I have contemplated ways of training or being a part of the training of photojournalists in the States amongst the Ethiopian or African community and in Ethiopia as well. I keep focused through Jesus Christos. I am recharged by Christos. I am given the mission to pursue justice for the downtrodden, for the poor, for those who are being oppressed, and I'm empowered, and I keep focused because all of these IDPs, whether they were in Mekelle or whether they were in Sakota or whether they were in Chagni or whether they were in Afar, they deserve justice. And technically speaking, according to my faith, it's a mission to pursue justice for all of them across the board, because that group of kids in that IDP camp at that school in Mekelle didn't ask to be there, and in some cases their parents didn't ask to be there either. Most cases, I believe. These people in Sakota who can't even go home because the TPLF is occupying their homes, they didn't ask for this. The people who the pastoralists in Afar, they didn't ask for this, to have, shells rain down on their homes from the mountains. One of the things that's not being told about Afar is that the pastoralists, their patches where their land, where they left homes behind, their homes, whatever homes were left, were burned down, So all in all, it's just like, I guess I call it the justice mission. It's throughout the Old and New Testament, the justice mission. It's there. And that's what empowers me, and that's what I focus on. I have my kids and I have my family and I have God. So that's how I recharge. But seeing the war end and seeing people be able to go back to their homes and live, whether it's in Walega, whether it's in, everywhere, wherever it is, people deserve to go back home and live and prosper. That's all.
Thank you so much. Hiwot, back to you. I think Hiwot's internet is a little bit acting up. So yeah, Jemal, what can I say? It has been a pleasure. It's been wonderful to have you. And I don't think this is going to be the last. I can see Hiwot arranging another second, proceeding and continuous discussion, because we really need this voice to be out. We need this voice to be echoed along the mainstream media. And then at the end of the day, we want a policy change that would restore humanity and dignity of people. And at the same time, even for that justice to prevail, we need, it's just like we need those kind of policy shifts. So I really appreciate and commend you for this. If you want to say a few words, one or two words, and also could you speak to the host of, Amhara host, because now after all these things, they're coming back. The Tigrayan brothers and sisters, their family, again, they're coming back, and who have been brutalizing their neighbors, but now they're coming back, and at the same time, the people are hosting them. What do you think of that? Until Hiwot comes. Once she comes, I will let you go. Promise.
Well, the funny thing is, the IDPs that I talked to outside of Hike, they spoke to that. They spoke to the fact that, TMH and all of the propaganda outlets spoke of, the Fano are going to kill you, the Amhara special forces are going to kill you. It was really pointed propaganda against the Amhara. But then once they get into the Amhara region and they get past Kopo, they are of the mind that all of this was wrong. I feel safe here. If you read the testimonies that I reported, the people I interviewed stated that they felt safe in that camp. Even though they're in an IDP camp, they're in an IDP camp in Amhara. And they had no issues with that. They just said they were watching all of the propaganda just melt or just be dispensed, because they were having real-time interaction with the people of Amhara, the people of Wallo. So to me, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise, because I remember when I was in Mekelle, part of what I do when I go into a region is sit down with real people and talk to real people. And I realized that, even the one fixer who I know was pure cadre, he and I had an honest conversation, man to man. And I respected that conversation, and I believed that he respected me. He wouldn't take me out anywhere, because I just would have called bullshit on everything, But No, I think that people are tired of all of this and they want to come back to their humanity, and they realize that, like pawns on a chessboard, people have been played against each other. TPLF has a lot to answer for and has done a great deal of damage to the society at large, far beyond the 27 years they were in power. But I think people are ready to live, and they want to live. They want to live, and they want justice.
Thank you so much. And Hiwot, I think you're back now.
I'm back. Thank you. Yeah, this has been such an amazing conversation. We had some feedback from our viewers that really appreciated this conversation. Hi, Alot, to mention a few, Eldana, Zalalam, and Dinash, Belai, and others that have been with us. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. Thank you so much, Jemal, for taking time on your Saturday to spend some time with us. And thank you, Dr. Fisaha, as well. I'd like to ask everyone that is watching this conversation to please share it with your family and friends, just because these are the conversations that are really important for us to understand what's going on in Ethiopia. And also, to reiterate how we started this conversation, we should be able to talk about, just like our guest Jemal said, the victims, and really figure out what the truth is and seek justice for all in every region of this conflict, let be Tigray or Afar or Amara or in Oromia, just so that we could get back in touch with our humanity and really figure out what's best for our people, and make sure that they go back to their homes and live a dignified life that every single person deserves, especially being in their own country. This is all I have. Until we meet next time, have a wonderful week.
Thanks for having me.